Hello and welcome to the Fit4Privacy Podcast, the podcast for those who care about privacy. I'm your host Punit and here we have conversations with industry leaders about their perspectives, ideas and opinions relating to privacy and data protection matters. Before we start, a quick disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed are not legal advice. So let's get started. Hello and welcome. Today in the Fit4Privacy podcast, we have two guests. Yes, normally we have one, but today we have two guests. One was a statistician in NHS, led a number of health-related intelligence teams, as well as improvement for better data usage at national level. And then right now, she's the managing director at a privacy company. I'll come back to the privacy company in a moment. And then we also have an informatics professional and a CDO who has 30 years of experience, including in various roles like CIO. The person has been in data governance, data management, project management, program management, and even information management. So we have wealth of information and knowledge here. And I welcome Helen Brown and Brent Walker, who have now a company called In the Know Limited, and they are in the management team of the two. And In the Know helps companies maximize the use of their data assets while balancing compliance with regulation and keeping in mind ethical considerations. So welcome, Helen and Brent.
Hi.
Hi there, Punit. Thanks for inviting us today.
Yep, looking forward to it. Yep.
It's a pleasure to have you. So if I may ask you, how did you get into privacy? Just to kickstart the conversation, how did both of you, because you have such a rich background and such a nice experience. So where did privacy hop in, or you hopped into privacy, whichever way we call it?
I think I got involved, Punit, because basically, as you've said, my background's more of a data background, and having led health intelligence services across the NHS for many years. And I think that when I moved into a national role, there were so many challenges with people being able to get access and to be able to use their data appropriately, that I became more of a troubleshooter in sort of like data and intelligence. And the reality was most of the issues were in data governance. So that's sort of like where sort of like it all started really about 10 years ago.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, when I was the chief information officer in a large teaching hospital, that makes you really, really think about privacy. We got so much data, obviously all of the medical record information, which when I started, most of that was still on paper, loads of risks, had to manage some interesting incidents, and you really get a feel for how privacy compliance is very, very important. And then joining Helen later on in NHS England, when we worked there together, using the same examples that she did, we were exposed to some big corporate privacy issues that we had to manage. So trial by fire, but we're both very, very experienced in privacy.
That's good. And it also helps when you have privacy knowledge or privacy experience, as well as other experience in IT, data, or information management, because then you are able to better understand and correlate what needs to be done.
For sure. I think that's been a real advantage. I think that many times you can place privacy controls over data, but if you don't understand the impact that has on the data, that has really big consequences for utility.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So let me also ask you our standard question, which is, how would you describe GDPR in one word?
Oh, Punit, what a question. I think you could consider that in many different ways. And I think I'd have to go for the word respect, because you can sort of like consider that from a data subject perspective. They've got the rights, for their data privacy and confidentiality, and we need to respect that. We need to respect that organizations have got a right to be able to use their data efficiently and deliver benefits from their data in a respectful manner. And, people who govern the processes that use data need to respect how data is used, and they need to act responsibility. You need to respect the data itself. You need to use the right data for the right purpose, and you need to understand the data quality and how that introduces error. And you need to, respect that you shouldn't inappropriately re-identify data where, you're using that sort of data. And you need to really respect the balance between data privacy and data utility to ensure that you get good quality compliant analysis.
Yeah, and for me, I'm going to go a little bit left of centre on this one, and it's really hard to say as well. Actually, innocuousness. If you can, I think that's the noun. And basically, what I'm trying to get across there is that if you get GDPR, right, then when you process, personal data, individual level data, that processing will be innocuous. And if you look at the sort of, I think the dictionary definition of innocuous, it means harmless, producing no ill effect, and it's inoffensive, it's unprovocative, it's not exceptional. So you're not going to cause harm when you process the data. And obviously there's two aspects. I'm sort of picking up on what Helen's just said as well. There's harm to the data of the subject if you breach confidentiality, or you process for purposes they wouldn't reasonably expect, or you're acting illegally, you don't have a legal basis to do the processing. So obviously you can cause harm to the individual, but you can also, if you don't get it right, you can cause harm to your own organization by not being compliant and suffering, the consequences of a regulatory intervention. But also back to the utility issue, if you go, too far with privacy and don't get it right from that perspective, you can harm the utility of the data and obviously not get the decision support that you need within your organization. So innocuousness, really hard to say, but hopefully that makes some sort of sense.
It's fascinating. I asked that question many a times, and it's rare that I get to hear the same word for the same law. It's very, very fascinating. So moving on, normally there's a lot of discussion around privacy compliance. It's challenging, it's complex, it's not possible, nobody can be compliant. But then, since you are from the background of data management or data governance, one way of looking at it, or a simplified way of looking at privacy compliance, is it's also a lot to do with your data management practices. Because if you do your data management, which you should have been doing, and it's a big, bold should have been doing, and if you're doing well, your privacy compliance should essentially be relatively simpler. So how do you, both of you, see the relationship between privacy compliance and data management, or call it data governance? Because for me, a lot of privacy compliance is all about data management and managing it well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Punit. I think privacy compliance needs to be delivered as part of the data management function. It's integral to the good practice for data management. It enables a proactive approach to be taken to governing data. And, many privacy requirements should be incorporated in everyday processes and carried out in a seamless manner. And there's lots of technology out there now which can help you do that. So as long as you've got a good policy and you know what you're trying to achieve and what your rules are that you're working to, you can apply that technology to enable the delivery in a seamless manner.
Yeah. I mean, data management, data governance is part of the wider set of functions that data management encompasses. And if you get data management right, and therefore data governance right as well, you can basically manage risks and deliver benefits. So some of the risks, obviously, we've already sort of touched upon. So, avoiding data breaches and getting privacy compliance issues, the risk of regulatory compliance, all of those things are really bad. You're going to get, potential fines, reputational damage, unexpected costs, legal issues. So all of those risks and the consequences are there. But if you get it absolutely right, then you can get a whole range of benefits as well. And that gives you, a competitive advantage as well. So, you'll have more money to invest in your services for innovation. You'll have a great reputation with your stakeholders. You'll get access to more and better data. You'll be able to use the data more effectively. So if you actually, get that privacy compliance integral to the data management function, then you're going to get this fantastic set of benefits as well, and making sure that the data that you've actually got is a true and valuable and useful and effective corporate asset.
Yeah. And then when we talk about data management or data governance, what is essentially behind it from a layman perspective? Because sometimes people say privacy compliance, it's clear, it's about rights, it's about breaches, it's about this and that. We all know the requirements, and everybody by now remembers them by heart. But what is data management for somebody who's looking at it from a privacy compliance standpoint?
Um, shall I start? Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a whole range of things you do as part of sort of data management, data governance to get privacy compliance, and trying to explain it to a layman. Yeah, I mean, okay, so understanding what your processing purpose is, this is what I need to do to deliver my organizational business, whatever that might be. And I need data for that. And this is the data I need to do that, so understanding the data, explaining the processing purposes, making sure that, it's not done in technical language. It's very clear and transparent. Obviously, following whatever regulatory regime principles are at play, so in GDPR, you've got things like the accuracy principle, the storage limitation principle, etc. Making sure that you are demonstrably, in layman's language, describing how you're going to process the data and what for. And how you will do things like how you'll keep it, how you'll protect it, how will you ensure that when you need to use it for other analytical purposes, you de-identify it properly. So all of those things, you need to make transparently and obviously clear to the data subjects themselves.
For sure, that's sort of like all of the setup stuff, and then you've got sort of like how you use data in a day-to-day manner. Making sure that your users of data are only using data for the purposes that they're allowed to. You've got strict controls on who can access what data, and that they can only access it for a certain amount of time. So and then that you also review sort of like all of your policies and processes to make sure that people keep up to date with them as well.
Okay, that's interesting. So in essence, knowing what data you have, what you do with it, and when you're using it, know that you have the right reasons to use it, and putting all the governance, all the processes around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and making that obvious, I think, in simple terms to the data subjects whose data you're collecting as well.
Yeah. So then there's another thing when we talk about data or data management is something called data accuracy. So now privacy laws have put some extra emphasis on that, saying data accuracy is one of the principles. But is data accuracy not a business need? Because there's so much of noise, so much of buzz around. We need to ensure data is accurate. I mean, you should have ensured it by now. And if not, why have you not ensured it? Because that's a business need. If your data is not correct, data quality is not good, how are your business contacts and business leads going to be good enough? So what's your view on that? Is data accuracy not a business need? I mean, why do we so much confuse it with privacy compliance issue?
I think this is a really, really interesting question. And for years of my career, I've battled this particular point. I think, absolutely all organizations need to have access to accurate data. But I think that the nub of the issue in this particular point here is, in my experience, I've seen so many companies that have implemented their privacy controls in isolation from talking to the people that actually use the data. And they don't necessarily understand the impact of, some of the ways that you can anonymize data or de-identify data, and how that impacts the actual accuracy of the data. So, regulations do have, principles for accuracy, but the guidance really needs to be clearer on what they mean by that. Because I think often people interpret it as the accuracy of the source data. And what they actually need to understand is that it's the accuracy of the source data, and it's also the accuracy of the data that they can produce after they've put their privacy controls on that data. So whether that means that the data has been de-identified or anonymized, the data they produce needs to be sufficiently accurate for the purpose that it's used for. And I think that, that's where you really need to join together your privacy professionals and your data professionals, so they come together to be able to make privacy compliance actually work and take account of accuracy at the same time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's absolutely vital that the data that an organization uses is accurate. But we also like to, use the word utility as well. By that we mean the data being absolutely fit for purpose. And Helen makes a really good point. It isn't just about the raw source data that you've collected for the primary processing purpose. If you want to use the data for secondary analytical purposes, then how you process that data to make it suitable for analysis, it's just as important that processing ensures an accurate output at the end of it. I mean, there's loads of examples from the NHS we could draw on. There's a big thing at the moment where people are looking at populations and trying to clump the populations into discrete groups and then give them appropriate proactive services before they become really ill. A thing called segmentation and risk stratification. And if you take the medical record data effectively to do that and then process it to work out risks and all the rest of it, if you get that wrong, you can put people in the wrong segment and they can get the wrong treatment or not get the treatment they need at all. So it's really important, even for analytical processing, that you actually do think about this utility and accuracy thing. It's vitally important, and you're right, GDPR and all the rest of it have all these things in, and we're hoping, the next set of guidance in the UK that's going to come out is going to make this very much more prominent, and make it a clearer and more definite thing for people to focus on. It's not just about the privacy. You've got to think about the utility as well.
So you use the word utility or data utility quite a few times. So what is exactly data utility, and how do you see its relationship with privacy, especially the data utility from an analytics standpoint or marketing standpoint or research standpoint when we analyze data? So what does data utility mean in that context?
Okay. It's a good question. You've got to have the right amount of data of the right sort at the right time. So we think about the data and analysis life cycle, from the data specification, data collection, data storage, data processing, defining data for queries, doing the query, doing the analysis, generating the output and then sharing the output. As you go across that cycle, we like to think about utility at each of those stages and making sure you've got the right sort of data in the right sort of form available to the right people with the right controls, so that actually they can manage privacy, but also get the results they need at that particular part of the cycle. We often see organizations taking a sort of blanket corporate approach to things like data minimization and restricting the data up front and then cascading that restricted data set down. We don't agree with that. We think it's not necessarily the best way to do things, particularly if you've got a range of processing purposes, and you've got a broad data lake effectively that you've got available. So it's all about trying to think about the utility as you go through and around the cycle, the analytical cycle, to actually make sure you've got the right data at the right time for the right purpose available to the right people with the right controls.
There are a lot of rights in there.
Yes.
So essentially, when you do a lot of right things with data, the data is useful and then data utility increases.
Well, yeah, if you do it right, yeah, it's not so much about not increasing and not reducing it. Obviously, as you de-identify data, then the utility will go down. There's this inverse relationship between data utility and data privacy. You can't escape that fact. And I think it's all about getting that balance right and getting an acceptable threshold understood at each stage of the life cycle. So you never have too much privacy. I know it sounds weird, but if you have too much privacy that's not necessary at that particular point, particularly around de-identification and anonymization, where if you're not careful, you can take the utility down and you're just not going to get the answers you need. And it's really insidious. You may not know this is actually happening until it's too late as well. So it may, it may give you flawed decisions that at the time seem fine, but in the longer term, you think, oh, why did we think that? It's because your data wasn't right and your outputs weren't right. So, it is really a challenging space, but, really important.
I think you need to find the balance.
Absolutely.
Because on one hand, you want to de-identify, or on the other hand, you want to have a utility around analytics being relevant and still fit for the purpose for which they were initially initiated.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with that. Yeah, totally. It is all about the balance. Yeah.
And then there's another concept in data that GDPR has put it in focus, or privacy laws are putting it in focus. That's called data minimization. Now, from the utility perspective, or also from the relevance perspective, if you have the right data, that's good for you, because then you're processing the right data for right purposes in the right way, as you used a lot of rights just to emphasize that part. And then the question is, why should it be an issue? How does this impact data utility? Because end of the day, if you have minimal data, that means you have quality data, and if you have quality data, it's good for you. So why does this discussion come in?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question as well. And I think that data minimization is actually something that is very misinterpreted across many companies. Data minimization doesn't just mean taking less data.
Yeah.
It means taking the right amount of data, or the minimized amount of data, but actually still having enough data for the purpose that you need to use your data to answer. And the reality is that many organizations misunderstand what minimization means. And they often think, well, okay, we'll take the minimum amount of data then, and we'll only make available the minimum to people to do their work. And the reality is you need to be able to consider minimization alongside, the other principles such as adequacy and relevance, and ensuring that your minimization is relevant to the purpose in hand. So the reality is you need to minimize at every stage of the data analysis life cycle. So when you collect data, you need to collect the minimum that's needed for the scope of purposes which you need to facilitate. When you store data, you need to store the minimum amount for the purposes it needs to facilitate. And each stage down the life cycle, when you extract data for a piece of analysis, you need to take the minimum amount of data for that piece of analysis. So it isn't a one size fits all, and I think that's where people struggle with it. Again, increased guidance from regulators around sort of like good practice in this space would be really useful for people. And a lot of the work we do within our company, within In the Know, we help people to understand this better.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, In the Know, we recommend this nuanced and very balanced approach to data minimization that's sensitive to the processing context and the processing purpose, elaborating on what Helen's just said. So you may have this massive data lake, that you've collected, which is still the minimum amount of data you need for all of your, processing purposes. And an analyst may want to, to answer a business question for a decision maker. So we think it's okay for, initially the analyst to maybe have a wider data set where they can understand properly all the nuances and interrelationships between data variables, so they actually can properly frame the business question and get exactly the right query design that they then need to pull down and do the analysis on. So, not just saying, here's your data analyst, off you go. It's actually, being, again, sensitive to the processing context and what you're trying to do. So exploratory analysis, you may have a bigger data set to refine a very discrete data set to answer the absolute business question. So that nuanced approach is how we'd like things to be.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes where you have a bigger data set to begin with, you can obviously use that as sample data or synthetic data, so people aren't actually accessing data that they don't need to look at.
Yeah. And I think when we talk about minimization, it's also about collecting the necessary data. Nobody's saying you collect less data than what's necessary. The only thing people are saying is collect what's necessary, no more than what is necessary. And that's
For sure.
an important aspect.
But the reality is that, people that set governance rules and people that, sort of like allow access to data don't always understand the scope of data that people need. And that's why the communication across sort of like the people that are using data to be able to produce analysis for business decisions need to be there and to communicate and effectively on a day-to-day basis, but also when these rules are being set and things like that, how you set your governance policies and processes up, you need to include, your analysts, your data scientists, and your data processing and governance staff. They need to work together to be able to get the best answers for their organization in a compliant manner.
And then what challenges, or what are the, I mean, challenges are a lot, but let me say, what are the three key challenges you see in this space of privacy, data management, data, and all this area? What are the three challenges you're seeing? And then after that, we would also like to get into how can these be addressed. But let's first understand what are the three challenges according to you?
Oh gosh, I could give you more than three, Punit. Okay, I'll
No,
go for
I know
three.
if we have a more than three, I mean, if you ask me also, we can discuss for 1 week and the challenges won't be over. But
Absolutely.
let's say three each, then not
Yeah.
three in
Three
total,
each
let's say three
then. That
each.
sounds a fair trade. Okay, I'll go with some fairly high level ones then. I think that one of the challenges that organizations have is, you need to be able to convince senior management how they can make the most of their data assets in a regulatory compliant manner. So that so that they can understand the privacy stroke utility challenge, and maximize their use of their data. That's quite a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I think that many organizations are still really struggling to be able to understand how they can legally share data for appropriate purposes, in a manner which engenders trust with their clients and suppliers of data. And I think I'd go for the third one, being the impact of poor implementation of privacy controls, is a real challenge for organizations.
Yeah, I think I can share. These are also some of the challenges which I hear. But Brent, what's your view on your challenges? I mean,
Yeah, I
not
think it.
yours, the challenges you
Yeah,
see.
challenges. Yeah, okay. So I think it's trying to understand what is and what isn't an appropriate use of the data that you may have. You may have a whole range of use cases for the data you have, and it's actually making sure that this is appropriate and that isn't appropriate, and how organizations come to that decision. I think there's a thing about how data governance is operationalized within the organization, and to make it something that's business as usual and not seen as the governance people over there in their silo, telling us how we have to behave. It's all about that thing that Helen mentioned earlier, that getting that dialogue between your data engineers, your data governance experts, and your data scientists, analysts, researchers, etc. We actually also think that people think it's just about de-identification, and we just have to pseudonymize or anonymize the data and it'll be fine. But it isn't. There's a whole range of other, technical, organizational process and environmental controls that you need to think about to actually make sure that data is, is being managed appropriately, and you're looking at the privacy and the utility aspects. And we tend, we don't want to generalize, but I will. I mean, we see organizations in like three flavors at the moment. You've got organizations that are potentially so worried about privacy that they're just not sharing or using the data that they've got access to or could have access to because they're worried too much about the privacy space. You then have people who are actually using the data, but they're making privacy more important than utility. So they're running the risk of, actually, not getting the right decision making. And then finally, you get the organizations, and, unfortunately, this does exist, who are more focused on utility than privacy, and they're running the risk of privacy as well. So it's actually trying to understand which of the three organizations they are and how you help them, get to the right place where they're balancing everything properly.
Yeah, that's true. And I would also add a fourth one, those who are not even thinking about GDPR or anything like that. But
Well.
I don't pay attention to them because
Yeah,
convincing them to even think about GDPR, it takes a lot of energy and time. So you're
yeah,
focused on the right group.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah.
So, if those are the challenges, how can these challenges be solved in your view? How can these be addressed? Because end of the day, if there are challenges, there need to be solutions.
Yeah, I guess what we set out to do was to develop an e-learning course which addressed all of these challenges. So that's where we developed the Quality Private Data e-learning course, which covers, how to understand data and compliance, how to understand the risks of identification and the risks of loss of data utility and accuracy. And also, how to be able to fix those problems and, inform people in an engaging manner. So, sort of like trying to train your workforce to understand how to do some of these things is a really big way of getting around some of these challenges. But specifically around sort of like, how do you help people share data better and convince senior management, I think that there's some really straightforward sort of like frameworks that you can use, which really help people to understand and engage people more. Because I think often when you think of GDPR, for a lot of people, it just feels too big and too hard. Whereas if you break it down into sort of like more digestible chunks and use frameworks such as things like the 5 safes, I think that, that makes it a lot more digestible for people to understand and to be able to work with. So, sort of like working and showing the benefits of, how you can use data better and how privacy doesn't have to be a blocker and how it can be an enabler. And, a whole range of things really, to just show the good practice.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to go into our course in massive and great detail. You need to buy it to obviously get the benefits of it. But yeah, building on what Helen said, getting the fundamentals, the principles in your head, using frameworks like the 5 safes rather than trying to memorize every article and recycle in GDPR. Getting the basic components of data governance in your head, but then actually really understanding both the risk of inappropriate identification, loss of privacy, and the risk of loss of data utility and accuracy. And by, looking at them, in the sort of cause, effect, consequence perspective, like, the teach you in Risk Management 101, which is what we do in our course, making sure people understand what causes the risks. And we go into great detail in that in our course. And once you understand the causes, then you can start to address them through a range of controls, mitigating controls, across the 4 different flavors I mentioned earlier: technical, environmental, process, and organizational. So that's our recipe, as it were, for managing these challenges. Basically, understand the fundamentals, understand the causes of the risks, understand how to mitigate the causes. And we have a whole range of mitigations in our course that people can use. As I say, I'm not going to go into detail now, but yeah, absolutely, it's all about understanding the risk properly. Yeah.
In essence, if someone has to solve the GDPR challenges or the privacy challenges or data challenges, an approach is understand what it is, know what you can do, you cannot do, and then make informed choices with management buy-in rather than trying to solve too much, and do it bit by bit. Because if you try to look at GDPR as full, it may seem complex, but when you take it requirement by requirement, piece by piece, and as we call it, eat the elephant in pieces,
Yep.
then it's more digestible, more doable, and it's more pragmatic for you and your management.
Yeah, do it in context, I think, rather than as a yeah.
And that's another thing. Do it in context, meaning look at it in your context, in your industry, in your situation. How does it fit? What do you have to do? Because in one industry, maybe in banking or insurance, you may have to do a lot more other things because of regulation, while in manufacturing it may be slightly lighter and slightly lesser, and then in healthcare it may be even more stronger. So you need to balance out in the context as well.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Good. So time flies, I don't know how, and I'm thinking we are almost at the end of it, and I would like to ask you, what would be your one final message to anyone who's listening or watching to this?
Ooh, one final message. Can I have 2?
Yeah, one from you and one from Brent then.
Oh, you're
no,
so...
you can have 2. I was just joking.
Okay. Well, I think that one of the things which I think is really, really important is know your actual risks. Don't work on perceptions. For example, if you've got a great big data lake, it doesn't mean that your risk of identification is massive. It really depends on how robust your controls are. So please work on facts, not on perceptions. And secondly, training your data workforce is one of the best controls to help maintain the utility and address residual risks of identification. So please do that.
I cannot agree any more on that. So that's in summary what you need to do to be compliant. Brent.
Okay. So don't forget that there is this accuracy principle as well as confidentiality, privacy principles. It's really important that you think about both things equally and try to balance them. And I guess that thing we've already touched on actually. Communicate, making sure you've got these silos in your organization between the techies, the analysts and the governance people, that they talk and they try and share a common language and they collaborate and they make work together to ensure that they're balancing privacy and utility at all times.
Sure. So now, if after listening to this podcast, somebody wants to get in touch with you saying, hey, I want to speak to Helen, or I want to speak to Brent, or maybe both of you, how can they get in touch with you? What's the best possible way?
Yeah, they can visit our website, which is www.itk.uk, and we've got contact details and things on there.
Yeah. We're also developing a free maturity assessment as well, which when you log on, you can choose to go through and be asked a load of questions and get instant feedback as well. So a little bit of, freebie for people to benefit from.
I think these days people love free things. So it was wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for your being here. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, ideas, and bringing in the perspective around data management, data governance, as well as privacy, because these three are interwoven and complex topics. So thank you so much, Brent, and thank you so much, Helen.
Fantastic. Nice talking to you.
Yeah, and you, Punit. It's been a pleasure. So thank you very much for arranging this.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for listening, and now we ask you for some help. Take a moment to subscribe and review this podcast. Your support matters. And if you have done it already, thank you so much. Now, if you have questions or suggestions, drop an email at hello@fit4privacy.com. And finally, if you know someone who will benefit from this, share this podcast with them and help us grow. Thank you so much. Stay safe and see you next time.